Welcome to our latest Vishlation. Have you ever stopped to think about how a sticky, foul-smelling black sludge that just oozed out of the ground literally built our entire modern world? I mean, it's pretty wild. Over the next few minutes, we are going to take a really deep dive into the epic journey of oil. We're going to explore how this mysterious liquid transformed over thousands of years into the absolute lifeblood of human civilization. We'll get into the science, the tycoons, the massive technological leaps, and of course, the geopolitics. So let's just dive right in.
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the ancient black mystery, look into the science of black gold, and check out the birth of an industry. From there, we'll cover the first oil empire, how oil became the engine of the world, and wrap up with the massive global power shift it caused.
Starting with Section 1, the ancient black mystery, and humanity's early encounters with oil. You know, long before massive offshore drilling rigs were even a thought, humans were already figuring out how insanely versatile this stuff was. Just picture Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, about 4,000 years ago. The Sumerians noticed this thick black goo seeping from cracks in the earth, and they realized water couldn't penetrate it, so they actually used this natural bitumen to waterproof their wooden boats, which totally opened up long-distance trading. They even used it as mortar for their bricks. Meanwhile, over in China, they weren't just skimming it off the surface. They were literally using hollow bamboo pipes to extract gas and oil from underground for heat. In Persia, they harnessed its destructive power for flaming arrows. And in ancient Greece, physicians were actually using it as a medicine for skin and joint problems. And the crazy thing is, modern science totally backs this up because crude oil has natural antibacterial properties. Ancient intuition was honestly centuries ahead of the curve here. And that brings us to an absolutely fascinating piece of trivia. In ancient Egypt, they used various natural substances to preserve bodies, right? Well, one of those was natural bitumen. The Arabic term for this natural bitumen was mumya. That's right, the exact same substance used to waterproof boats gave us the modern English word mummy. Oil quite literally seeped into our ancient language and culture. Moving on to Section 2, the science of black gold, where we look at how this stuff is actually made. Okay, we have got to shatter a massive myth right off the bat. Raise your hand if you grew up thinking oil comes from fossilized dinosaurs. Yeah, me too. But the scientific reality is actually much stranger and way older. The story of oil begins 300 to 400 million years ago. That is way before a T-Rex ever walked the earth. It didn't come from giant dinosaurs. It came from billions of microscopic marine organisms, tiny algae and plankton just floating in ancient oceans. So let's break down exactly how this microscopic life turns into the fuel that runs the world today. It is a wildly slow process. First, these marine organisms die, sink to the ocean floor, and get buried under endless layers of sand and mud. Over millions of years, and I really want to emphasize that, millions of years, the Earth applies intense heat and pressure underground. This completely transforms the organic matter into this waxy substance that scientists call kerogen. Now step 4 is where the magic happens. When the temperature hits a very specific sweet spot, right between 60 and 120 degrees Celsius, that kerogen breaks down into crude oil. If it cooks a little too hot, boom, you get natural gas instead. Finally, because oil is lighter than water, it naturally seeps upward until it hits a hard layer of rock and gets trapped in these massive underground reservoirs. For thousands of years, humans had absolutely no idea they were walking on top of world-changing oceans of energy. They only used what bubbled up to the surface. Which raises the ultimate 19th century question. If these massive reserves are just sitting down there, why couldn't we just pump them out?
Well, the answer to that changed history forever. Section 3, the birth of an industry.
Picture the mid-19th century. The Industrial Revolution is exploding. Cities are growing rapidly, and people are desperate for a way to light their homes at night. Now, at the time, the go-to fuel for lamps was actually whale oil. But there was a huge problem. Intense overhunting was driving whales to near extinction, which made whale oil incredibly scarce and wildly expensive. The world desperately needed a new fuel source. Enter a Canadian geologist named Abraham Gesner in 1846. He figured out how to refine crude oil into a clean, safe-burning fuel, which he named kerosene. Suddenly, there was this massive, insatiable demand. Oil wasn't just some weird waterproofing goo anymore. It was an absolute gold mine. The only issue was figuring out how to get enough of it out of the ground. Back then, finding oil was considered pure luck. But a man named Edwin Drake saw it differently. Now, Drake wasn't a fancy scientist. He was a retired railway worker sent to Pennsylvania to try and drill for oil. And for months, he totally failed. His company was losing faith, the money was drying up, but Drake just refused to quit. Finally, on August 27, 1859, he struck black gold. And get this, how deep did he actually have to go? Just 69 feet. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the height of a 5-story building. At 69 feet down, thick, black liquid began surging up his drill pipe. For the first time ever, humans hadn't just waited for oil to seep to the surface, they had actively pumped it out. And with that, the first commercial oil well and a massive new global industry was born. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the first oil empire and the rise of Standard Oil. Amidst all the chaos of the early oil boom, you can really see the difference between just gambling and actual business strategy. The wildcat drillers were out there obsessively digging holes, hoping to strike it rich. But John D. Rockefeller, he took a completely different approach. He looked at drilling and realized it was way too risky. One day you're a millionaire, the next day your well dries up and you're bankrupt. So Rockefeller just completely avoided the risky part. He realized that crude oil straight from the ground is basically useless until it's refined, so he focused entirely on refining and transporting. He secured secret deals with railway companies for incredibly cheap transport rates, starved out his competitors, bought their failing businesses, and ultimately controlled the choke points of the entire industry. That laser-focused strategy led to the creation of Standard Oil in 1870. And within just a decade, Standard Oil controlled a staggering 90% of all the oil refined in America. Rockefeller essentially owned the entire industry. Fast forward to 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court actually forced Standard Oil to break up into smaller companies due to monopoly laws. But here is the wild part. Rockefeller kept his shares in those new companies, and their value absolutely skyrocketed. His estimated net worth reached the equivalent of $400 billion in today's money. The guy who refused to drill for oil became its undisputed king. Next up is Section 5, the engine of the world. So the invention of the internal combustion engine is what really changed the trajectory of human history. Suddenly, the true explosive power of crude oil was unleashed. In 1886, a German engineer named Carl Benz created the very first successful petrol-powered car. At first, people thought it was just a rich person's novelty. But then, in 1908, Henry Ford launched the Model T. By using assembly line production, Ford made cars cheap enough for everyday people to actually buy them. Almost overnight, millions of cars were hitting the roads. Then came trucks, buses, and tractors. Oil was no longer just for lighting up our living rooms. It had officially become the beating heart, the literal engine of the entire global economy. And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, the global power shift. Let's look at how the geopolitical center of gravity completely shifted away from the Americas. In 1908, a British expedition made the first major commercial oil discovery in the Middle East, over in modern-day Iran. But the real game changer, that happened when the search shifted to Saudi Arabia. For years, they drilled and found absolutely nothing. But finally, in 1938, Dammam Well No. 7 struck an absolute ocean of oil. Soon after, massive reserves were discovered in Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE. The world suddenly woke up to the fact that the greatest energy reserves on Earth were sitting right beneath the deserts of the Middle East. Realizing the immense leverage they held, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Venezuela banded together in 1960 to form OPEC, specifically designed to control global oil production and pricing. The true weight of this new power block was shown to the whole world in 1973. A war broke out in the Middle East, and when several Western nations provided support to Israel, Arab oil-producing nations responded by utilizing their greatest asset. They cut oil production and placed an embargo on supplies to specific countries. The economic fallout was immediate, and it was staggering. Global oil prices skyrocketed. Massive lines formed at petrol pumps across the world. Factory costs surged, and inflation spiked. Without taking any political sides here, the pure historical reality of 1973 proved one undeniable, somewhat terrifying fact. A disruption in oil supply could literally bring the entire global economy to its knees. From a mysterious black goo used to waterproof ancient Sumerian boats to the ultimate prize in modern geopolitics, the journey of oil really is the journey of human civilization itself. It gave us light, it gave us unprecedented mobility, and it built our modern industries. But as we wrap up this vishlation, I want to leave you with one final thought. The fuel that drove the modern world is also its greatest vulnerability. When our entire global civilization becomes totally dependent on a single, finite resource pulled from deep within the earth, what happens when that resource finally runs out? Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.